Here we are. It's a pleasure to be at Post Rotati in New York City. And my name is Chiz Schultz. I'm a producer, and tonight we're going to see a screening of Ganja and Hess, a film I produced in the 1970s.
I don't know how many of you have actually seen it before. Okay, so some of you have and some of you haven't. This is a very unusual movie, and probably whatever preconceived notions that you've had walking into the theater are going to be wrong and unhelpful. Even if you've seen it before, that's probably not going to help you either. It's that unusual of a film. What happened was, in the early 1970s, there was a growing movement in the Hollywood industry to make movies that would cater to black audiences. And ultimately, this would evolve into a genre that people have referred to as blaxploitation, movies that were very action-oriented, sort of like, pumped-up film noir, with sort of a revenge, fantasy fulfillment style. This was a movie that didn't fit into that genre. It was created because the producers at the time thought there would be a chance to reach out to that audience with a movie that they wanted to be a black vampire movie.
Historically, Blackula, the first African-American vampire film, had opened and had done tremendous business, had just made a fortune at the box office. Kelly Jordan had formed a partnership to make 5 films, each one for $350,000, most of them with African-American filmmakers on African-American themes. Quentin Kelly and Jack Jordan originally set out to do 5 feature films for $350,000 each. Michael Schultz directed a feature with Diana Sands, and it was shot in Lebanon. It was released. We were able to put together with our $350,000 Ganja and Hess. Maya Angelou was about to do a film and had hired the crew and was in Stockton, California when the company went bust. An African ambassador was to do one, and then there was one being done on a James Baldwin story. The only 2 finished were ours and Michael Schultz's.
As it happened, they contracted to make their black vampire movie somebody who was interested in making something much more nuanced and not necessarily fitting into easily any specific genre, be it blaxploitation or horror or whatever.
They went to Bill Gunn, who was recommended to them, and I don't know how they got to Bill, and said, would you write an African-American vampire film? Bill was dying to do his own film, write and direct his first feature film. So he saw this as an enormous opportunity. The last thing he wanted to do was a black vampire film. But before he said no out of hand, he thought, wait a second, is there a way I can use their money to do my first feature film, use maybe a kind of vampire theme, and do slight vampire, but really do it for my own, what I want to say about addiction. So that for Bill, this was a chance to do a film about addiction. And I remember Bill saying to me, the funniest thing in the world is there's this terrific thing about vampire movies, about this terrible fear of blood, drinking blood and so forth, that blood is like, ugh, horrible. And he said, but blood is what we all have in our veins. When we're dying, we get a blood transfusion. When people need blood, the Red Cross says, would you give your blood? He said, there is nothing more treasured and revered in our country and in the world than blood. It's a life-giving force. So he wanted to do a twist on that. And he also felt that the need for blood, the vampire's need for blood, or in this case Hess's need for blood, was no worse than alcoholism, drugs, sex, any other addiction.
This is a movie that is not driven by its story. It is much more about the mood and its atmosphere. It's almost, I think the only other movie I can compare it to is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire, a film that is not really about what happens, but about how those things happen. It was so unusual at its time that the producers felt that it couldn't be distributed. They gave up on it almost immediately.
And opening in the wrong theater helped. They opened on 57th Street where the audience didn't expect anything. And it ran, 3 days, and they took it out and recut it.
Kelly Jordan opened at the theater on 57th Street. They had Klieg lights in front, panning the skies. They called us and said, we're sending limousines for all of you to take you to the theater. This is when we didn't have enough money for props. Now they were suddenly, for the opening, spending this lavish money. And we just thought the opening was all wrong. We thought it should open in a small art house and build from there. Or take the festival circuit, which it did later in Cannes, and then building on that, become word of mouth, here's this weird film. But instead they opened it up like any other major feature in New York. And it wasn't. I mean,
but what happened was he went to Cannes. While he was at Cannes, or right after he came back, but before the reports came in or whatever, the film opened, and they opened it in the first possible theater. They opened in a small little theater on 57th Street. You know that history? And of course, the audience they invited was the wrong audience completely. There was no horror fans there. There was much of anybody there other than the Jordan group that they did the invitations. And the critics just slashed it. They destroyed it.
It was mainly a white audience. They were shocked, they were sort of horrified. They didn't know what the hell they were watching.
And then, of course, then they gave it to Heritage, I believe it was Heritage, and Heritage wanted to change it, and they asked me to do the cuts in it, and I said, look, I'm not the one to do the cuts because I like the film the way it is. So they said, yeah, but it could be better, can't it? And I said, I don't think so. I don't think how it's going to be better.
They decided that Kelly and Jordan thought maybe they could get some money out by selling it out to a group that would release it as an exploitation sex film for drive-in theaters. And they hired a guy to recut it because, as Victor said, he wouldn't touch it. We loved it the way it was. So they hired a guy, and he recut it and tried to make it into kind of a sexploitation, black exploitation film for drive-in theaters. And Bill and I were invited to a screening that they had to see how we liked it. And 10 minutes in, Bill said, I'm out of here. And we walked out, and we took our names off it.
When we went to the screening of the new version, and we were invited, and it was Jim, Bill, Chiz, and myself, and we sat in the room, and it was over. We just looked at each other and sort of walked out of the room. I mean, it was nothing. It was just dismal, and immediately the next day, Bill took his name off the credits. I took my name off the credits. Chiz took his name off the credits. And Jim Hinton said, it really is still my photography. It's because that hasn't changed, although I hate the film. And we said, well, don't take your name off the credits. So he didn't. But there was no reason why he should.
They changed it so much that almost all of its original makers had their names removed from that version. And it is that version that for 25 years was the only one available.
And a little side story to that is I knew the editor. We'd passed each other in all kinds of things. And we were sort of talking acquaintances and almost friends, not really friends, we never socialized. And the one thing I didn't want to do was to see him. And the one thing I wasn't going to do was to talk about the film. So I sort of went into the men's room to let everybody get out of the theater. Of course, Bill wasn't talking. We weren't talking to each other. We talked the next day. But so when I came out of the men's room, I get into the elevator, and lo and behold, who comes into the elevator with me is FEMA. And just the two of us. We're going down the elevator. And he says, well, what do you think? And I looked at him, and I didn't know what to say. And I said, well, FEMA, let's just hope that in the future you do your films, I do my films, and we never meet again. And he said, oh, you really don't like that film, did you? And I said, no. And then I wanted to leave. And he wouldn't leave. He walked me to Grand Central Station. That's 4 blocks. He said, I'll walk you. Tell me what you don't like about the film. And, of course, then I told him everything. Then I slammed it. I mean, everything that was wrong with it, which I'm not going to go into, although I could. But I'd have to see it again, and I don't want to.
Back in 1998, I had the opportunity to meet Mr. Chiz-Schultz and put the film back together again the way its makers intended. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 5.
I first met Bill Gunn because I had seen him in an off-Broadway play, Take a Giant Step, as an actor. And I was so impressed with his performance. I was working at CBS at the time, and we were casting some stuff. So I went backstage and introduced myself. And then later we met, and we had, I can't remember, lunch together or something like that. And then that started the friendship. We never were able to, I was never able to cast him in one of the things we were doing at CBS, but that cemented a friendship. And then not too much later, he said that my family and I should really move out to Nyack, where he lived, that we'd love it. And we did move to Nyack, thanks to Bill. Bill even helped us find a house. And that cemented the friendship. We've been friends ever since. I had been working with Harry Belafonte, for about 3 years. And when I first joined Harry, he had a bunch of feature film scripts. And one of them was a script called The Angel Levine. And he was looking for a screenwriter. And I recommended Bill Gunn because I had read some of Bill's other works. And Bill got the job. It was a feature film for United Artists, which I produced. And Bill wrote the screenplay. And it was just a magnificent screenplay, a wonderful screenplay. And then later, I think it was later, Norman Jewison, with whom I'd worked in television, I approached him with a book called The Landlord, which I'd read, and I thought would make a wonderful feature. And he liked it, and I recommended Bill Gunn to write the screenplay, and Bill wrote the screenplay for The Landlord. I can't remember exactly what year Stop was done, but I know Bill had achieved a reputation because of Angel Levine and because of the Norman Jewison Landlord. And as I remember, he was approached by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers had just started a program for low budget. It was one of the first of its kind, low budget films. And they brought Bill in under contract as a writer for Warner Brothers. And he was flown out to Hollywood. He moved to Hollywood briefly. They gave him his own office. And I still remember the great story from that was that at one point Bill had been working there 2 or 3 weeks. And the man in charge for Warner Brothers, the executive, came in and said to him, "You know, Bill, if this picture that you're writing is a success, you will never have to write another word in your life." And Bill said it was like the kiss of death. He had never heard anything so horrible in his life. So he couldn't wait to get out of there. But that's how Stop was done. So that sort of led up to then Bill coming to me, saying that he had been offered a job to do a feature film, his first, and would I produce it? And I said, absolutely.
Bill Gunn's big thing was when one day we were talking, and he said, "Can you imagine somebody, now that you know me," he said, "can you imagine somebody coming to me to do a vampire blaxploitation film? Can you imagine anybody even thinking that I could or would do it?" And I said, "Yeah, but you did write the script." He said, "Yeah, I wrote the script to get the money to do the film." He said, "Otherwise I wouldn't have the money. The last film I did never got released. It was they smothered it on me." He said, "But how would anybody hire me for that?" It was beyond his ken that he would do that kind of a film. So he wrote a double script. In his mind, it was always the film that came out, not the film that they bought.
I think Kelly Jordan were very upset as we progressed and as they suddenly realized that the screenplay wasn't a commercial black vampire film. And at one point, I remember a scene in the office in which they were saying to Bill, they were almost saying, "Look, you've got to make this more commercial, you've got to do this." And Bill threw a chair through the window. And Quentin Kelly turned to him and said, "You're crazy." And Bill said, "You have no idea of how crazy I am." He said, "I have more craziness in the top drawer of my bureau than you will ever imagine." And I still remember that line. That was one of the scariest lines I've ever heard in my life. But Bill was, that was true. Bill did have more craziness in his top bureau drawer. And one of the interesting things is we were just about to go on location to this beautiful mansion that you saw in Croton that we had arranged. And we had no money. It was really such a tight budget. And someone came to my office and said, "There's someone here to see you." And this guy walked in, sort of a tough guy, and he said, "I hear you're doing a film in Croton and shooting there." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I hear it's called Ganja and Hess." I said, "That's correct." And he said, well, I'm from the Teamsters, and you haven't done anything with us. You haven't hired us. And I said, gee, I'm really sorry, but this is really a low-budget independent. We don't have the money to hire the Teamsters. And he said, I understand that the house that you're going to be shooting in is all wood, and very flammable. Wow. And I couldn't believe I was hearing that. And I said, well, I don't know about that, but yes, we are shooting there. And he said, well, we got to be on the film. And I said, well, look, it's a low budget, it's independent. The entire cast is African-American. The crew is African-American. He said, what? And I said, yes. He said, they're all black? And I said, correct. He said, okay, go ahead, shoot. So that was really interesting to me.
Some of the artwork was done at the Brooklyn Museum. That was as a second unit location.
What about the church?
Nyack.
The church is still in Nyack, and that's the actual congregation, and the woman in the red jacket is the minister of that church.
I think the house is gone now. I looked for it. I think the house is gone now.
Maybe.
Teamsters finally got to it.
Dwayne and Bill knew one another. They were friends. Bill was teaching French and English at, I can't remember what college at the time. Dwayne had been the lead, in a sense, in Night of the Living Dead, the famous George Romero film. And Bill contacted him and asked if he wanted to play the lead, play Hess in this film. And Dwayne had a lot of reservations because of being the lead in Night of the Living Dead. Through the years, whenever he taught class in college, invariably, he told me, a student would suddenly look and point at him and say, Night of the Living Dead, you're the zombie. So he was very, very hesitant about doing another feature in which he would play, quote, a vampire. But because of Bill and because of the nature of it, that it really wasn't a vampire film, it was much more than that. And it was the lead. It was an extraordinary part and a challenge. Dwayne said yes.
Well, one thing should be said in behalf of Miss Clark, the principal actress. She was too pretty for that era. So she didn't become a very popular actress during that period. I mean, now you have the Halle Berrys and, beautiful looking black women, but in those days that was a disadvantage. If you were an attractive black female, you didn't get very much work.
Same with Marpessa Dawn.
Right.
It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Marpessa Dawn from
Black Orpheus.
Mm-hmm. Same.
Well, that was an era before the beautiful black actors. I mean, Dorothy Dandridge suffered from that. A lot of attractive black female actresses suffered as a result of that. I mean, the mammy stereotype was enforced back in those days.
In Bill's head, he was going to do a quotation mark Ingmar Bergman type symbolic movie, trying to get black culture into it, trying to change the description of blacks. I mean, he was he just didn't understand, well, he understood it. He just didn't appreciate the fact that the only blacks that were allowed to be in movies were killers. Back then, he was the first person to write a film with a very intelligent, learned black. Just because he was black doesn't mean he doesn't have the education and everything else. He said, that's the reason. He said, I wanted him to speak French. I wanted that French scene. That was a very important scene for me in the film. That's that garden scene where all the people come together and you meet his son. I mean, it has nothing to do with the film. It's this idea that when Bill did this film, he kept putting things in all out of nowhere. He just would pop these things up, which is the strength of the film as far as I'm concerned.
Bill's working method was visual. Before we shot, I remember his talking to the wonderful cinematographer, Jim Hinton, that we had. And he just showed him dozens and dozens of pictures from National Geographic, from Vogue, from any magazine, from art books, of saying this is the kind of color this scene should have. This is the kind of composition. This is kind of sky effect. Bill was very visually oriented. Certainly the writing was important to him, but much more important as far as the film went was a kind of wonderful look and visual quality. As far as the actors, he knew them. And Bill would draw aside the actor and say, here's what I want from you. And a lot of it was kind of improvisational, but in most cases they stayed with the script.
Bill really never followed the script. He had it in his head. The actors read it, but he let them go. They never had to worry about getting a line the way he wrote it. You know, he had written his lines and his stuff, which he knew. So obviously he knows what he was going to be saying. And then again, I'm not sure that he didn't change it all. But he is a really strong believer in allowing a creative person to create, including he allowed me to do a lot of things that he just allowed me to do, which is he respected my ability, and certainly he respected the actors, and he allowed Jim Hinton to shoot things. I mean, he never sat there and said, okay, we're going to set the shot up like this. He'd tell Jim what he wanted. Jim would set it up. He'd check it out quickly, and he'd let Jim control it. And then he would come up with other ways of using it. And there's a lot of improvisation in the film.
So there's Bill Gunn's version of Ganja and Hess, the one that played in New York for roughly a week, the one that Gunn took with him to Cannes, the one that we have put out on DVD. That's the director's cut, the one that he's proud of, the one that he and the other filmmakers consider the preferred version of the movie. And then there's the other one, the one that Heritage Enterprises distributed to drive-ins, put out on videotape, and was released under any number of titles. Blood Couple, Double Possession, Black Vampire, Black Evil, Blackout, The Moment of Terror. I mean, you've got like a half dozen different titles to this thing. Where Ganja and Hess differs from the original screenplay, it tends to conform to the version Blood Couple. Where Blood Couple differs from Ganja and Hess, it tends to conform to the original screenplay. In other words, Bill Gunn, Chiz Schultz go in with this finished screenplay, go to Kelly Jordan, and get permission to make that as the movie. Reluctant permission. They thought, it's a weird movie full of idiosyncrasies, but that's the movie that they set out to make. On the set, various inspirations, new ideas, new directions present themselves. And during the editing process, Gunn and Victor Konevsky really go with this idea and lend the film a completely new flavor, a completely new characteristic, something far more abstract, more artistic, more challenging to the audience than what had been written. When Heritage Enterprises gets Fima Novak to come in and recut the movie, basically what he does is take footage that Bill Gunn had written, that Bill Gunn had directed, that the various actors had performed on the set with Bill Gunn and Chiz Schultz and everybody else watching and approving. They take that footage that Bill Gunn had created but rejected and uses that to turn the movie back into the thing that Gunn had originally set out to make.
As far as another version in which some things were added that hadn't been in the original version, most of that was between Bill and Victor saying that doesn't work, let's take it out. And I think in most cases they opted for the visual and the sensual rather than for just straight plotted narrative, which bored everybody.
We felt that we didn't have to explain things. Bill's big answer to any critique was, whatever you want to see in the film is what you'll take out of it. He used to quote Ingmar Bergman on that. You know, when people would ask Ingmar, what does it mean with the clock running down the hill, or what does that mean? He said, whatever you want it to mean, that's what it means. He would never explain his symbolism. And Bill had exactly the same attitude. He would never explain those things. But if you did ask him and you made him explain like he was in front of an audience, he'd come up with some kind of a reason. Whether it was real or not, it didn't make much difference. He spoke so well, and he was such a poetic guy that it was easy for him to roll out a lot of stuff. I was always very surprised at some of the things he came up with.
When you have a very good editor and a good director, as we did, our editor was Victor Konevsky.
And when we first met me, he hired me on the basis of a photo animation short that I had done. It was an illustration of Dylan Thomas's poem, A Child's Christmas in Wales. And he just loved it, so he hired me. And when the producers said, but you haven't seen him cut a feature, what about dialogue? What about this? I mean, that was Chiz, who couldn't believe that Bill said hire him. And then Bill said, no, he's fine. And then they said, well, he sent another little film. So why don't you look at that? He said, well, if I have to. And he looked at the other one, and that was nothing but a montage of boxing. It was just a montage that I sent because I didn't have access to a feature that I had cut. So he saw those two things. He said, fine, hire him. And when he met me, that was it. And when we sat and looked at the dailies, he never said anything. He let me talk. And after 2 days of screening dailies, he said, well, you seem to know what I want. And he'd walk out, and he never looked at the dailies again. He only if I told him something was wrong, then he would come in and take a look. But I don't think I ever did tell him something was wrong because I didn't know if anything was wrong. Because I never bother with the script. I don't really read a script even when I cut a feature. I look at it and check it out, but I don't try to follow it. I look at the footage. It's documentary training, and Bill loved that. He never asked me to look at the script. So a lot of the stuff I would put together in the wrong order. Just because it didn't hit me. And then a couple of times Bill would say, you know, that gets a little too confused. I think you got to put it back the way I wanted it. Okay, fine, because I didn't do it deliberately. Nothing I did was deliberate to change something. I would just come up with those ideas.
And the music was done by Sam Wayman, who was also in the film. It really, Bill and Victor worked beautifully together. And Sam Wayman, the composer, worked beautifully in the mix and the post-production, laying in the music.
I did want to make a major change in the film, and it was a week before the mix, or 3 days before the mix, and I came up with another idea, and Bill and I were crossing 8th Avenue, and I told him the structural change, because we really worked very, very closely together. And Bill listened, and he said, that's very interesting. It might really work. He said, but it's too short a time, and I'm not sure that the character of Dwayne's character that he was playing could handle that kind of a situation in his head. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I don't see any problem with that. You know, basically what I wanted to do was to bring Bill Gunn and Marlena into the house at the same time and have both doing their thing with Dwayne. While that was going on, they didn't know the other was in the house, and it could have been cut that way. And that would have gotten Marlena introduced a lot earlier, which is one of the problems with the film, because I think the film really takes a step upward when Marlena appears, when she's in that phone booth. That's an incredible scene. I always love that, where she just appears out of nowhere. You know, as most things in that film happen out of nowhere. You know, that was the surprise of the film.
Yeah, it was shown at Cannes, and it won the Best Film for Critics Week. And Josephine Baker went all over and on the radio and everywhere, television, supporting the film and praising Bill Gunn's work.
It was the only film selected for a director week, first film by a director for Director's Fortnight. It was the United States official entry selected by the committee.
And one of the only times that the United States entry was rejected afterwards by the United States. And critics here panned it and said it wasn't the right time for a black art film.
That's basically what Ganja and Hess is. It's an emotional study of people and various attitudes. Death and after death and before death and vampire time. So it is a horror film. It was made as a horror film.
I mean, I'm just so pleased that it has come out on DVD in such a beautiful, beautiful edition. I mean, it's just the colors, the quality of it is something that I know if Bill were alive today, he would just be absolutely thrilled. And I also know that when I talked to Victor Konevsky, the editor, to Jim Hinton, the DP, they were just thrilled that someone had the foresight to produce it on DVD and bring it out again. Because I still hope that at some point people will catch up to the fact of who Bill Gunn was and how talented he was as a writer-director and a very wonderful person and very, very ahead of his time.